Which of the following is the primary reason for the South being in a position of structural weakness? Now, structural weakness, a position of structural weakness is mentioned here. This statement says, apart from all the economic pressures, adherence to development puts the South culturally and politically in a position of structural weakness, leading to the absurd situation in which the North can present itself as the benevolent provider of solutions to the ecological crisis. The reasons for this, directly given here, is this: the adherence to development and the economic pressures. But that said, implicit in this are other reasons. Let's look at the options first, and then we will decide which ones relate, which one doesn't. Option A says the persisting notion of the booming economies of the North and the deficient ones of the South. Now, this is actually a valid answer. It doesn't seem like it, doesn't even seem connected, but it is actually a correct answer because we can see this here. This is talking about the willingness of the North to pay up the aid and the benefits that it had promised to the South in the 70s. The reference is here. The spotlight was thus largely focused on the North's willingness to come up with the $125 billion of yearly assistance to fulfill its long overdue promise of allocating 0.7% of its GNP to development aid to provide clean technologies or access to bio-industrial patents. On the diplomatic level, this was hardly surprising for most of the third world, trapped by the failure of the politics of catching up, fears that the world will eternally be split between the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies. So the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies, these two aspects, they suggest the booming economies of the North and the deficient ones of the South. Then also the persisting notion, the fear that the world will eternally be split between. And this is for most of the third world nations. So this is something which is a kind of a perspective on this. So on the diplomatic level, this was hardly surprising. What was hardly surprising? That the North is willing to come up with the assistance that basically fulfills its long overdue promise. So this says that is hardly surprising on the diplomatic level, because for most of the third world, they believe that the world will eternally be split between the North and the South, and in particular, the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies. So this is actually a valid choice because this is not presented as a reason for structural weakness, rather an expectation that there will be structural weakness. So A is a valid choice. Option B says the inability of the South to escape the emulation of the economic infrastructure of the North. Now, this has a same line of argument as the other three options, which we'll have to eliminate, or which we are tasked with eliminating. So the inability of the South to escape the emulation of the economic infrastructure of the North. The aspect of emulation is in the aspect of utopia. In fact, the Rio documents make clear that the South has no intention of abandoning the Northern model of living as its implicit utopia. So we see that the North, it has a model of living, and the South emulates this model, and it has no intention of changing this fact that it emulates the Northern model of living as its implicit utopia. Here, of course, we are not talking about living as an actual life. So we're talking about overall economic scenarios. So the emulation, the copying of the economic infrastructure of the North, that is one aspect, the ability of the South to escape. So the South is unable to escape it. And then we see that this is presented as a factor for, or this is presented rather as a resultant of the South's pursuit of development. We see it here. If matters look bad with respect to the environment, according to Southern countries, they look worse with respect to development. So with respect to development, and this entire paragraph is about this point itself. that things are looking really bad in terms of development, especially in the context of the southern countries. So this is a reason we can see from this that the southern countries, or this arises from the southern countries uh, basically pursuing development over other priorities. And then we see that because of this, the economic infrastructure of the North, etc., all of this mentioned, this is what gives rise to the adherence to development that puts the South in a position of structural weakness. So this is actually a reason for the South to be in a position of structural weakness. So B is an invalid choice. In simplicity, we find the reference to this here. We find the inability of the South to escape from the economic infrastructure, the emulation of the model of living of the North here. This is something that connects to the aspect of the pursuit of development by southern countries. And the pursuit of development, as we see here, the adherence to development puts the South culturally and politically in a position of structural weakness. So this is actually a reason why the South is in a position of cultural weakness. Option C tells us the inveterate tendency of the South to pursue development and prioritize it all above all other concerns. We have already checked this. We don't need to check it again. The South basically demands development. It prioritizes development. Development is the most important aspect for it. This we can see particularly from the first paragraph. You can see it here. Speaking of the South, it is stated already in the Beijing Declaration. The point was made clearly and bluntly. Environmental problems cannot be dealt with separately. They must be linked to the development process, bringing the environmental concerns in line with the imperatives of economic growth and development. So development is something that the South actively and almost desperately pursues. That said, it is this adherence to development. This is the point that C is making. So that said, this adherence, this tendency to pursue development and prioritize it, that is what puts the South in a position of structural weakness. So once again, this is a reason for the South being in such a position. Hence, C is also incorrect. Option D says the willingness of the North to fulfill the promises of aid and other benefits made in the 70s. Now, we see it here. The spotlight was thus largely focused on the North's willingness to come up with the $125 billion of yearly assistance to fulfill its long overdue promise of allocating 0.7% of its GNP to development aid to provide clean technologies and or access to bioindustrial patents. In this, we find that this is something that is in response to the South's demands that we can see from the second paragraph. Consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. So as we've seen from the first paragraph, these were the demands that were made in the 1970s by the North. They were unfulfilled. The South reiterated these unfulfilled demands and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. When the North follows ecological preservation or requires ecological preservation or expects it, the South follows development. That we have also seen from the first line of the third paragraph. Because of that, the aid that the North is willing to pay to the South, or at least the aid that the North is willing to give towards development and the provision of clean technologies, etc., would be to the benefit of the South. This would again be an example of the South's adherence to development. This would also be an example of the South having no intention of abandoning the Northern model of living as its implicit utopia. The South continuing to subscribe to the notion that the North shows the way for the rest of the world, and as a consequence, it being incapable of escaping the North's cultural hegemony. So in all of this, we find this is also evidence of the South pursuing development, and the pursuit of development is that which puts the South in a position of structural weakness. So D also is incorrect. We can eliminate it. The correct answer is option A.